First off, thank you for signing up for this class. I hope that over the next 8 weeks, you're able to pick up some valuable information that helps you on any future projects that you might be working on. So a little bit about me. My name is Dylan Ekren. I'm a character modeling supervisor at Disney Feature Animation. I've been at Disney for about 5 years, and I've gotten to work on such films as Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, Big Hero 6, and most recently Zootopia. So after school, I freelanced around LA for a little bit in some small studios, doing things like illustration, storyboarding, a little bit of generalist 3D work, and even a little bit of animation. It was a pretty valuable experience for me because I got to dip my hand into a lot of different types of projects in several different industries, ranging from commercials to games to feature films. I got my start at Disney in the talent development program, where I got to be an apprentice and sort of learn what it means to work in a big animation pipeline, and also be able to run upstairs and bug people that were way better than me and get feedback on my work and all that kind of stuff. So I took great advantage of that. And over the next several weeks, I'm going to try and impart some of the best things that I've learned from working in feature animation onto you to help you with your projects. So these days, I think that it's very easy for people to find all sorts of resources and tutorials on how to learn software and how to do, how to make specific things. And there's an endless amount of brushes and materials and things that you can download from the internet, but hardly any of it really focuses on the mindset behind creating characters or what really goes into creating appeal in a character. A lot of it comes in the guise of something instructional but doesn't actually deliver. So one of the things I want to do differently with this class is really kind of think about our characters before we jump into them, and hopefully help you develop some tools that will help you along the way. So this class is going to be a little bit different than most in that we're going to focus specifically on appeal and readability in our characters. It's not a ZBrush techniques class. We won't be talking about what size or type of brush I'm using or the UI settings or anything like that. It's also not a production modeling class. We're not going to talk specifically about best practices for topology or how to fit our character into an animation pipeline, unless that information is relative to what we're specifically talking about that week. Our goal is to create a great VizDev sculpt for art director buy-off, just like you would in a real production setting. The way that we're going to do that is by developing a mental toolkit that we keep in mind at all times when we're working on our characters. This will help us plus and improve our characters and help us think like a designer. So this is week 1, 2D design principles and fundamentals. This is going to be the most lecture-heavy week of the entire course, because this week we're going to talk about all of the core concepts and things that we're going to constantly refer back to in the weeks to come. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the first lesson. Thinking like a designer, and then being one. So one of the most important parts of working with stylized characters is being able to think like a designer would. Every decision that a concept artist makes is important to the look and the overall feel of the character when they're done. And just so, every decision that we make as sculptors needs to be just as informed, because we have to build upon and improve that knowledge. We need to be able to improve and plus the design for 3D. It's important to think about what choices are being made in the character and why. So by studying the art and with a basic toolkit that we're going to talk about, we can start to learn to think like a designer. Toolkit. So our toolkit is going to be a set of mental tools that will help you out of a jam and hopefully improve your work. And the first one of those tools is drawing. Yes, like with a pencil. So it's no secret that animation style characters are all based in drawing, right? It makes sense. I want you to think about drawing as a tool for yourself to learn to improve. You can use drawing to explore ideas and styles very quickly. You can learn composition, balance, shape language, and rhythm, and how that applies to sculpting. In fact, 2D art and 3D art sort of feed back and forth into each other. So the better you get at one, the more you'll improve in the other. Drawing is also a meditative practice. It puts your thoughts in order and focuses your mind on a single task. Here's an example of what drawing means to me. So, for me, everything starts with the drawing. Even a simple sketch helps form a blueprint for a sculpt. I always do some degree of drawing before I start any sort of 3D art. Drawing teaches me all kinds of new things. I'm always able to explore new shapes and styles much quicker on paper or in Photoshop than I would be able to in ZBrush. Drawing also changes the way that I think about 3D art. As I mentioned before, 2D and 3D often feed into one another, so the more drawing I do, the more I tend to think in simple graphic shapes when I'm sculpting in 3D. And then the more 3D sculpting I do, the more I tend to rotate my drawings in 2D. I start to think about these characters from all different angles. Obviously, you can explore all different types of characters and styles with drawing. And just like 3D, drawing is often a construction process that starts with broad strokes, and then you find the detail and the personalities you go along. You always build up your work from a strong foundation and structure. One of the most important things in animation is being able to turn a character with your drawings before that it works in 3D. So by properly plotting your approach and understanding the intention behind the artwork, you'll be executing your sculpts at a much higher level. Here's a great example I found of a Harley Quinn turnaround by Bruce Timm. So here you can see a lot of work has gone into this character before she ever makes it into a production setting. And all of that sort of research and work that goes into exploring this character really pays off when she finally makes it into a 3D version. There's a direct correlation between the 2D art and the 3D version that we see on the right. This applies to any work that you're doing for yourself as well. So here's an example. This is a witch character that I was working on, where I did a series of drawings and sort of took what I liked about each sketch and applied it to the next version or iteration, and discarded the things that weren't working or things I didn't really like. And as you'll see, this character evolved quite a bit before it made it into 3D, and then quite a bit afterwards. I really learned a lot in this process, but the main thing that I learned was being prepared for the task before I actually started on it, and then also being able to sort of roll with changes and think critically as I went along. So one of the things that we want to do as 3D artists is to work smarter and not harder. And that's the purpose of this mental toolkit that we're going to talk about. So this is kind of cheesy, but it is a quote that I like, and it's very applicable to what we're talking about. If I was given 6 hours to cut down a tree, I would spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. So I don't know if it really takes 6 hours to cut down a tree, but Mr. Lincoln was very tall and presidential, so we should probably listen to what he says. But actually this quote is about preparation, right? So studying the work before you jump into it. And that's what we're going to do. Study the art before we actually get in and start sculpting. What can you do to help formulate a plan? Maybe gathering research or drafting out some sketches first or something. Regardless, jumping straight into your work can result in more spinning than is necessary. So one of the common misconceptions that I run into over and over again is that stylized or cartoonish characters are somehow easier to make than more realistic or high detail characters. There's this idea that more detail is more impressive or makes for a better character. I think that highly detailed, realistic types of characters are awesome, and they definitely have their place, but it's a different set of skills that goes into creating something for animation, or something that has a very refined style to it. Simplicity and readability become even more difficult sometimes, especially as it becomes easier and easier to add detail using programs like ZBrush. During this class, I'm going to urge you to never lose sight of simplicity in your characters. Oftentimes, the simplest and most direct, easily readable route is the best way to go. There's no easy answer for what makes a stylized character appealing, but that's what our toolkit is for, and we're going to try and think about some core concepts that help us keep that readability and simplicity in our character. So let's jump in and start talking about the toolkit. These are the mental tools that you can use to help keep appeal and readability in your sculpts. These are the types of concepts that 2D designers are aware of, and they are incorporating them into their work almost subconsciously because they use them so much. So the first thing that we want to talk about is resources. Gather and use resources. I really can't stress that enough. It's so easy to just jump into 3D sculpts and start sculpting away and think that you know what something looks like. But the truth is you really don't. You need to find reference and you need to use that reference. And it's something that you're just going to have to do on your own in this class because I'm not going to be checking for it. But I'll know if you're not doing it. What types of resources are we talking about? Artist models, anatomy sculpts, anatomy books, art books and sketchbooks of things that inspire you. I use Pinterest all the time. Anytime I start a project, I will create an image board on Pinterest of just tons of different references and resources that are at the ready so that I can always pull that stuff up and look at it whenever I need to. I create reference boards from everything from anatomy to cloth or clothing, hair, anything that's relevant to the character that I'm working on. This is not going to be an anatomy class either, but it is important to any sort of character that you're making because even stylized characters are grounded in reality. So you're going to want to use anatomy and reference to help you. So let's get into the real meat of this week, and those are the actual concepts that are going to help us bring our characters to the next level. The first concept I want to talk about is line of action. Line of action is an invisible line that follows the gesture of the pose and distributes the weight of the character. So here I have 3 examples of that. I've got a dancer on the left, a real photo of a dancer on the left, Sony Mizuno. And I've got a great Han Solo sculpt by Steve Hsu in the middle, and a drawing by Helen Chin on the right. I'm going to draw the line of action over these things now. So this dancer on the left, we can see there's a very clear, simple line of action that runs all the way through the character from head to toe. For this drawing of Han Solo, we have a nice sweep that comes all the way through the whole body and then down the arm and out the barrel of the gun. In this drawing by Helen Chin, there's an S-curve that goes from the head all the way through the whole body and then out this leg here. It's important to think about line of action when starting any drawing or character. At a certain point, it will become automatic to you. This is also something that we're going to discuss in greater detail when we get to posing. The next concept I want to talk about is straights versus curves. And what that is just very simply a straight side versus a curved side. Another way of thinking about straights versus curves is a simple side versus a complex side. By incorporating this concept into your sculpts, you will always have one side that's more detailed and draws the eye of the viewer, and one side that's more simple and follows the line of action of that particular limb or part of the body or whatever it is. The next concept I want to talk about is thick to thin or tapered shapes. And what that is, very simply, is just a form with one wide side and one narrow side. This helps direct the viewer's eye and also keeps shapes more interesting. Another way of thinking about thick to thin is just always avoiding parallels. We never want 2 lines that are totally parallel to each other unless it somehow serves our design. So now let's see some of these fundamentals working in a real-life example. Here's some great drawings of Flynn from Tangled. We can see every single one of these drawings has got a very clear line of action, which I'm drawing right now over the top of these poses. Even the ones where he's standing fairly straight up and down and not really doing much have a clear and distinct line of action and an intent to the pose. We can also see a great use of straight and simple sides versus complex and curved sides. This draws our attention to one particular side of the form and makes the overall drawing more interesting. You'll notice that oftentimes the straight or simple side sometimes mirrors the line of action. We can also see our concept of tapered shapes working everywhere in this drawing. It creates a more dynamic look and feel to the character. And the absence of parallels in this design makes the whole character feel dynamic. Here are some more examples of just like straight up anatomy study of Flynn. So we see all of the same concepts happening over and over. We get a curve to a straight to a curve, and then over here, straight into a curve, curve, straight, straight, curve on the other side. You'll notice that the apex of one curve is never symmetrically mirrored across the form as we go. There's always a certain amount of asymmetry to add visual interest to the character. Here's a good example up here. We see the break of that curve is higher up on one side than it is on the other side. If this was totally symmetrical, we would end up with a much less interesting shape to look at. Even in these simple arm studies, you can see the concept of straight to straight, curve, straight, and then curve over and over again. even as the arm rotates around. There's always a way to find this principle in everything that you're sculpting. Even in these very, very simple sketches, you could say that straights and curves and tapered shapes fundamentally make up even very simple drawings like this. Look at how much information can be communicated by just adhering to these very simple design principles. You'll find these concepts in all types of art all over the place. Here's a couple examples from J.C. Leyendecker. You can see that Leyendecker used all of the same principles that we're talking about now, by having tapered shapes in the cloth here, and then we get a very straight side on the out. We get a very straight outer edge versus a curved edge in the middle. We get curve, curve, straight, straight, curve, straight, curve, all the way through the cloth here. Even on this head over here, we have a very, very simple straight side with a break here. Then this curve comes around to the front of the face. This is the real visual interest area of the face. Even within that area, we get straight, curve, straight, curve, a curve into the lip here, and then straight, curve, straight, curve, all the way through the chin. It's a little bit more subtle, but a very good example of how effective this principle can be. Moving on, we have even more applicable examples of straights and curves and tapered shapes. Over on the left, I have a drawing by El Gunto, where we can see he's built this entire character on the same concepts that we've been talking about. Straight, and then a more complex curved side, with none of our curves being broken up evenly. Taking a look at just this hair by itself, we have a very simple straight side, and then a more complex wavy curved side. It creates a very nice graphic shape. But we can see the principle of tapered shapes being used to high effect all the way through this whole character. Nothing is parallel, and it creates a very dynamic flow to the whole character. Over on the right, I have a drawing by Shane Glines, where he's done the same exact thing. We have a nice use of straight edges to denote hard, bony areas of the face, and then a very subtle curve, all of which makes up a tapered shape that creates the whole head. But you can see even in the hair here, he's kept it interesting by having straight lines versus curved lines, straight to curve, all the way through. Nothing is parallel, nothing is flat, nothing is straight across, he's not doing any sort of mirroring, and as a result, your eye flows over the whole character in a way that's very intentional. One more concept I want to discuss is large, medium, small. And that's just simply the idea of adding a physical importance to different parts of the body. So I've got a drawing by Corey Loftus over on the left, where we've emphasized the large torso of this character. That's the biggest part of his whole body. The second biggest part, the medium part, is the gauntlets or gloves or arms or hands that he's got. And then the smallest parts of his body are his face and his legs. So we know that this guy's a bruiser. We know that he's a big, kind of strong guy. It's just an instant read sort of thing that we get just by looking at that character. Another example by Nico Marlet in the middle here. You can see he's gone and intentionally boxed out this huge area that is this guy's body. And then the medium sort of shapes are his arms, much smaller. You could take his entire head and beard sort of as one sort of medium shape. You can see how that makes a very nice sort of cone shape. But then the smallest area of the whole character is his face. So here he's using large, medium, and small to denote scale of this character. Even with no sort of reference around him, with no environment reference or anything around him, we know that this is like a big guy, right? Over here on the right, we've got another drawing by Corey where he's using, really nice, first of all, really nice tapered shape right here. But also, he's put a huge emphasis on this character's gigantic head and mouth. So we know it's important to this guy is eating, right? He is, as if the burger wasn't enough sort of indication for that. A couple more examples just to really drive this home. These are Nico Marlet drawings. We've got the same type of thing. We've got a very simple shape, very simple line along the bottom of each one of these wolf monster guys. Heads and necks. You can see every single one of these has just like a very simple shape along the bottom. And then the top shape is much more complex. We get all that kind of spiky, aggressive detail. Every single one of these. And then he's also illustrating large shapes, like this neck is one large shape. This whole face is kind of a medium shape. And then we see like the eyes and teeth are making up these smaller sort of secondary and tertiary details. But everything is tapered. You'll notice that nothing is parallel. Even this whole head from ears to nose creates a nice triangle shape. The eyes themselves also have like a sort of football shape, the whole thing. And the smallest part of the whole composition, the teeth, triangular. It's a very well thought out and effective character design. Here are some maquettes that were made for Brave by Andrea Blasic. In both of these maquettes, we can see all of the principles that we've been talking about so far. We have a really clear straight line into more complex curved shapes, curves that turn to straights that turn back to curves. We also have very nice tapered shapes. This guy's overall silhouette is a tapered shape. We have straight parallel lines where there's no visual interest, where we just sort of want our eyes to move on. We've got nice tapered thick to thin shapes all the way through the whole body. And we've got a nice relationship of silhouette to interior lines. Here's another sculptural example by Damon Bard. So here we've got a very strong line of action that follows from the foot all the way through this pike or spear. It's very clear. And then we get sort of the secondary line of action effect from these feathers. You can see that Damon has spent some time considering the way that this sculpture would be read as we rotate around it in 3D. We have a very nice curve on this sleeve that translates perfectly into this hand. It picks up there. We got a nice curve to a straight to a curve back into that sleeve. And the same thing is happening over here. The sleeve curve comes down and translates right into that hand. There's a solid break where the hand folds over, curve, and then straight. One other concept that's really effective here is the translation of silhouette shape into interior shape, as I'm illustrating with this yellow line. So that's one of the things that we're going to talk about too as we start to rotate our characters around in 3D. Just a few more examples that I've found that I feel make great use of the concepts we've talked about so far. So here's a 3D sculpt where specifically the horns, we see a nice series of straight hard edges, none of which are the same length, broken up nicely all the way on the outside. And then the interior form is just one simple curve all the way through. Even this dividing line isn't perfectly symmetrical all the way through the whole horn, and it just makes the read of that horn very, very nice. We get a nice S curve on this horn over here. One side is a little bit more complex than the other, and it creates a good readability in this whole character. Even in the character's face here, we get a nice sort of taper all the way up to the top, a nice break here, a very, very simple side over here, and then a much more sort of complex side over here. Because really, this is the area that we want to look at. And then finally, I have this design by Shane Glines over here, which is just a great example of all of these concepts working well together. So we've got overall tapered shapes, we've got a more complex curvy side, and a more simple straight side, and we've got a very clearly readable line of action within each one of these forms. We've also got these legs, which appear to be fairly symmetrical and straight up and down, but they actually taper down towards the knee and then taper out a little bit again towards the foot. This creates just a nice balance through this character all the way through. The next thing I want to talk about is instant read. Instant read simply means being able to look at any character and immediately figure out a couple things about who that character is. This is something we're going to talk about some more when we get to posing, but it's important to think about now. One great example of readability is the Valve game Team Fortress 2. So when Valve first designed this game, all of the characters were wearing sort of a similar military camouflage outfit. And from any distance, it was impossible to tell which character was which. So they took a step back and they redesigned the game so that every single character had a very unique silhouette that was recognizable from any distance. In order to do that, they really amped up the style of their game, and in my opinion, sort of paved the way for stylization in video games for the next years to come. The point is, changing the silhouette of these characters made them all have an instant read. You can already tell so much about these characters just by looking at their silhouettes. As an ensemble, it's even more effective. This is a Mark Davis drawing of Maleficent. Maleficent is easily one of my favorite animated characters of all time. There's an elegance and grace to her design, and she's a great example of everything that we've talked about so far today. Maleficent is a great example of instant read. Everything about her character says bad guy. If we take a look at the most obvious examples here, everything in Maleficent's design is triangular and aggressive. Even her whole head is a triangle shape. And then there's this repetition of triangle shapes all the way through her whole body. One of the things I really like about this design is how the exterior silhouette perfectly comes across and then merges and becomes interior lines. We see that happening over and over. Maleficent is also designed in such a way that we're always paying attention to her face, because there's lots of lines telling us to look directly there. The straight lines of her staff guide our eye straight up away from her costume and right to this face. All of these triangular collar shapes flowing outwards point directly into her face. Here's another still of this character, and we can see all these principles working really well. All of our attention goes right here to the face. Another great example of instant read would be Boba Fett from Star Wars, right? Right off the bat, we can tell just by looking at this guy that he's a bad guy. What tells us specifically that he's a bad guy? There's no sign on Boba Fett's chest that says, hey, I'm a bad guy, but there's a certain shape language to his design that tells us stay away, aggressive, mysterious, evil. He's got no eyes. Everything is hard-edged and aggressive. He's a great example of bad without being super obvious. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Kirby. I would say that Kirby is probably the exact opposite of Boba Fett, but his design is no less effective. He's all soft, round shapes, and unless you know someone who's really good at Smash Brothers, he's not very scary. Here's a couple drawings by Bruce Timm. We've got Batman on the left and Catwoman on the right. This Batman drawing is such a great example of all the principles we've talked about so far. Just a very simple straight edges on the inside of forms, and then more complex curved sides on the outside of forms. We've got just a series of tapered shapes over and over, all the way through the whole form. It's very effective and readable, and when Batman moves or does any sort of action in the cartoon, we know exactly what he's doing. One interesting note about Batman is he's designed like a bad guy. He's got all dark colors, his eyes and face are mostly obscured, lots of sharp, aggressive angles on him. But it's a perfect design for his mythology and his particular world. So bringing your character's story and environment into the design is equally important. In contrast to Batman, we've got Catwoman over here, who has a much more curvaceous line of action. And even though all of her forms have more of a curve and roundness to them, they're still following that same basic principle of straight and curve. Complex versus simple. This is Mr. Incredible and Syndrome from The Incredibles. Here we see two characters with relatively similar shape language that are very different in the actual story. Shape language alone doesn't dictate whether your character is a good guy or a bad guy. It's not like everything triangular is bad and everything with round, soft shapes is good. We see a pretty good mix of both of those things in both of these characters. The way that you present your characters can obviously have a huge effect on how they read. So let's review our toolkit, starting with thinking like a designer. So every stroke of the artwork that you're working from is intentional, and it builds towards the look and feel of the character, and your sculpt should be no different or any less informed. You need to get inside the headspace of the designer and understand the decisions that they made and why they made them. Plan ahead. Always gather and make use of reference. Sit back and think critically about the concept you are working from before you jump in and start. This way you're reducing the amount of time spinning and trying to figure things out. Go in with a plan on everything that you start. Shape language. Think about the 2D fundamentals that we talked about during this lecture. Think about all of those concepts and how they can plus your work in 3D. Pay close attention to the way your forms read and what they're telling the viewer. Always be clear and simple whenever possible. Look at your work. Get in the habit of taking a step back after making major changes or sculpting decisions on your character. Make sure that whatever you choose to do has a purpose and that it's adding to your character rather than detracting from it. So this is our toolkit for now. We'll revisit these concepts over and over in the weeks to come. But for now, let's jump into the homework and see how we can apply everything we've learned so far. Alright everyone, let's get to the homework for this week. So the first thing that I want everyone to do is choose 3 concepts that they'd like to work from, and then we'll narrow it down to 1, and you'll spend the rest of this class focusing on that one character. You can choose any 3 characters from any artists that you like, but my recommendation is to take stock of what you think you can actually get done in the weeks to come. I don't want you to fall too far behind working on a character that's way too complex, so keep it simple if you can. Also, please don't choose 3 characters from the same artist. Spread it out a bit and try to find a nice variety. The next thing I want you to do is draw something. I feel like I can hear some of you groaning right now. The goal of this part of the homework is just an exercise for you, to get you to start thinking a little bit more critically about the shapes that are going into your drawings and into your work, and how they read. You could even choose 1 or 2 of the concepts that you found and just do a draw over and try to find some of the things that we talked about during the lecture. The main part of the homework is going to be practicing good shape language in 3D. And I'll switch over to ZBrush now to show you what I'm talking about. Here we are back in ZBrush. I've got a polysphere here that I'm going to turn into a low-res Dynamesh object. I'm not at all concerned with topology for this exercise. So let's just go ahead and build our concept art for this part of the homework. And what I mean by that is I'm going to construct a shape now that sort of exemplifies all of the concepts and principles that we talked about during the lecture. So I am creating a shape that has an overall taper from thick to thin right here. I'm going to rotate around and make sure that the shape language is consistent all the way around. You'll see by doing this that all of these 2D concepts become much more complex when we have to do them from all different angles. But the goal of this exercise is to get you just automatically thinking about this. Imagine that this shape is going to be the forearm of a character. So down here we're going to have a hand, and then up here will be the rest of the arm. So now I've got a shape that has a nice taper. We have no parallel lines. You'll notice I did these cuts at opposing angles. And now what I want to do is go in and let's make one of these sides just a little bit more visually interesting than the other side. Something like that. And I'll use this sort of mechanical brush here to crease that out, just to really make a statement with that shape. So, instant complex side, instant simple side. And you'll notice that information, that shape language carries across this whole form as I rotate it around in space. There's always one side that's got a little bit more complexity to it. We can even amp that up. And then one side that's very simple and smooth, and our eye follows along nicely. One other thing to note is I'll never break a curve up perfectly symmetrical. What that means is from top to bottom of this shape, there's just one long kind of simple curve. But the apex of that curve is up here, and never right here in the middle, splitting that whole form in half. All right, so this is the concept art for our homework, right? This is the same type of shape that we're going to replicate over and over as we build out a little mannequin for ourselves, and then we can start to explore how these individual small pieces contribute to the overall look and feel of a whole character. So following the same lines of logic that we used to create this shape, we will eventually build out a whole character like this. And all I did to make this mannequin was just repeat that same process over and over on each one of these pieces. And then with a little bit of shaping and pushing things around, I'm able to create a very simple character that I can build upon or easily change the shape and size and scale of to give me a couple different variations. And that's what we're going to do for this homework. So once you've constructed something like this for yourself and spend a little bit of time on it and make it nice, you can then go in using Transpose Master, or even just if it's all one object, move brush and transpose, and you can get all kinds of different variation. So you'll see this is the same guy, but all I did was just play with scale and thickness and all that kind of stuff. I just played with these shapes. I kept the same ideas in mind as I was sculpting, thick to thin, large to small, straights and curves, complex and simple, and then just rotated around in space as I was sculpting until I created a new variation. So use this to explore some different styles or just some different basic silhouettes for characters. Try to come up with 3 or 4 characters that are uniquely different. Don't add any extra detail or anything like that. Just keep everything at the very, very basic shape level like we're doing here. You'll see that by reducing this entire character down to its constituent parts, we're able to achieve a great deal of readability and style just by thinking about those very simple concepts. So I hope you put some time into this homework this week and really have fun with it and push yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone maybe if you can. I can't wait to see what you come up with, and I'll see you next week.